one footnote before I start that I hadn't expected, and that is because Tim so wonderfully reminded us that Law Day is such a special day. I will tell you it was my father's favorite holiday. He was a guy that helped land on the beaches of Normandy, and he very much believed in the rule of law, and that after World War II, our mission as a nation was to overcome the scars of genocide, and that Law Day was the most important way of conveying this. And it's a very, very rarely discussed holiday, and you just made me realize that I'm speaking on the day that mattered most to him. So I have to say that because that's what this is about. First of all, thank you, John. I don't believe I've ever seen anyone give the kind of energy and just open-ended motivation to make things happen that you give us. I'm gonna do something very unusual. I want the applause before I talk instead of afterwards. Please join me in saluting John Fuller. Okay, so I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. When I become president in October, I am committed to the idea that the theme for my year is science and technology reshaping the practice of law, and science and technology reshaping our daily lives. And I am committed that every program we do will somehow be part of that idea, and that's not so hard, because it really is that way in real life already, and we just don't know it. So my slogan, to the extent I'll have one, is making the legal desert bloom. And today I'm going to give you one example of what that looks like. You take all those possibilities, the science, the wonderful new technology, and the marvelous law that my father so honored and revered, and try to do something in health law. I want to underscore that this is one of several problems that can be approached and handled with this array of tools that we have in this generation that did not exist before. And so I'm going to use as a case study something that really baffles me, that I just can't get my head around, okay? Until we have the machines that we are working on to replace women as the bearers of children, society needs pregnancy and mothers and live births and mothers alive after those births in the early years of life of those children. And we've been doing this for centuries. We've been doing it in every country, in every culture, in every place there's been human life. So I am really confused how it's possible that in the United States of America today, one of, if not the richest nation in the world, we have increased maternal mortality, and it's at rising, and it's at a point where we are behind countries that we think of as poor and less developed. And so I'm using that as my example of how we could take all these marvelous tools and try to do something. But I assure you there are plenty of other health questions. Should telehealth be licensed across state borders? Should environmental justice just be about specific neighborhoods, or something that looks across the country or across the world at specific diseases in reaction to climate change and various environmental toxins? Those all could fit this. But what I want to look at is maternal mortality and trying to do something about it using the tools that we have, such as the right to health. And I want to thank my Georgetown Law colleagues. This came out of a team effort from one of my classes last semester. And just so you can know that I actually do know something on this subject, this is the book I wrote about genetic testing during pregnancy. It's an outgrowth of my Johns Hopkins thesis in my Master's of Science, not an MPH. You had to have a real peer-reviewed discussion. And this is the book that's from my doctoral writings in Switzerland. So I really know something about this subject. And these are the 7 points I'm going to try to hit. Just so you know, I have an outline. I'm not going to read the outline to you, but I want you to know that I know where we're going. It's not as random as it may appear at first. So first of all, when you talk about something like the right to health, which is codified, you're going to see around the world in a whole bunch of places and in a whole bunch of ways, but not codified in our humble country. Maybe it's not just positive law. Maybe it's something about natural law. And there's this long, old debate that's been pretty much silenced in the 20th century about whether natural law exists and whether it's more important than positive law, because throughout the 20th century, we were writing all these laws. And before those laws existed, what you relied on was principles that were pretty much universal and discussed a lot in legal literature, but were considered natural law. And of course, Georgetown is a Jesuit university. Definitely the Law Center taught us a great deal about natural law. But I love this phrase, and this phrase is now 101 years old, which means that it's actually older. And what I love about it is two things. I love the phrase itself. I think it's beyond poetic, it actually has meaning. And I love the fact that it comes from a full generation, if not longer, before those first codifications that are typical of the 20th century. And I'm giving it to you because although the rest of the world has a lot of positive law around health, we don't. So if we look for a reason why we want to have health in our law, we're going to have to go back in the time machine to this kind of natural law idea. Just close your eyes and listen to this. Rights are not mere gifts or favors motivated by love or pity, for which gratitude is the only fitting response. A right is something that can be demanded or insisted upon without embarrassment or shame. And I think this is something that's totally appropriate for a discussion about maternal mortality. So what's positive law, Ilise? We know natural law is this pretty phrase that you just read us. Positive law is when people get together, usually from different countries, but could be a legislature, and they take an idea and they try to make it into law. And the business of the 20th century really was the codification of legal principles and writing new principles for governance with the force of law, which is really how we got Law Day in the middle of that century. So the legal definition of health under positive law did not exist when that phrase existed. There wasn't one, but there is one now. And it's been around a very long time, and it's actually quite popular. It's actually been copied into a whole bunch of places. It's the World Health Organization definition. And they say a couple of things that are extremely important. First of all, this is probably the best piece of legislative drafting of the 20th century, is this beginning of a very long definition of health, because it's so flexible, and yet when you read it, you feel like you know what they're talking about. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and I will tell you, nobody knows what social well-being really meant when they wrote it, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So the idea is that something could come along that hurts people, and it would still be something that health people have to worry about. The example was in the 1990s, HIV had really taken hold in the 80s, and by the 90s, people were worried about it on a high level across nations. And they knocked on the door of WHO and said, what are you doing about HIV/AIDS? They didn't say, where'd you get your jurisdiction from? They looked at that, not merely the absence of disease and infirmity, and they said, why aren't you doing more? And then the controversial part, of course, is the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of those fundamental rights of every human being. But notice there's no sort of minimum or maximum in this language. That's extremely important. And people like this definition. People have put this definition into a whole bunch of constitutional law and other treaties, the Cairo Declaration on Population uses this to say reproductive health, and then just copies the rest of the sentence. So this was a very successful drafting job, and it gives you the idea that health is a human right, or is it? What if you're born and you're too sick to ever get well? What if you're born and you're poor and you could get well if somebody spent money taking care of you? What if you're from the wrong race or the wrong ethnicity and some government doesn't want you around anymore? Are you going to enjoy those human rights? This is a very tough question that has not yet been resolved. And we look at that as a starting point for other analysis. So I want to show you from that starting point internationally now, not yet about countries, there's a lot of law around the world to tell people that health is a human right and that we should be doing something proactively to protect it and foster that human right. This is a list from the UN webpage of a variety of what are called treaty bodies. These are not ordinary treaties. These are treaties that have committees that have the right to talk about stuff, and governments can complain about whether somebody is obeying these rules or not. And they generate written opinions, and they have regular meetings. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm only going to talk about 2 of them right here. But these have the mechanism for taking that language from WHO and trying to do something more with it. And I mean, these are heavy hitter people. These are serious people. One of my favorite documents in the whole wide world is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And when I was a little girl, and there was still the Cold War, this was a very bad document, because the world that I grew up in the United States, thought that the more important document was the International Covenant on Civil Rights and Political Rights. And these were sort of misbegotten twins that were an outgrowth of a bigger document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, at least why aren't you talking about that? It's not a law. It's a declaration, and they knew they couldn't get consensus to turn it into law or a treaty, so they never tried. They just left the declaration. But then a few years later, they got the idea that we should really elaborate upon the ideas in that declaration. And this particular covenant is the only document in the world that says, Article 12, the states parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And there's actually a section called Right to Health. And what's fascinating for this problem of maternal mortality is they actually talk about stillbirth rates, infant mortality, and healthy development of the child. And what got me knowing about this in the first place was that if you read further on, they talk about industrial hygiene and occupational health, which of course is extremely important for moms who have not yet given birth and are working. So this is the clearest discussion of the right to health in international law, and it's been around a very long time. The next thing from that list that I just showed you of these treaty bodies where you can go and complain about stuff is the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. It's the so-called CEDAW. And CEDAW actually has a CEDAW process. There are committees you can go to, and you can get decisions that determine whether your country has obeyed or violated CEDAW. Not us, we haven't signed. Okay? We don't sign anything. We, the United States of America, on Law Day, I'm here to tell you, we don't sign anything. So we are not part of these documents that I'm showing you. But the rest of the world is, as I will show you. So CEDAW protects pregnancy. It has very specific language about taking care of ladies who are pregnant and providing them with all kinds of services and things. And it's very, very inspiring, except it has a problem. Yeah. CEDAW, I haven't decided, I don't know anyone else that's been looking at it this way, But I haven't decided if CEDAW is really a friend or a foe, because CEDAW has a section that talks about what's called special protections during pregnancy. And most people don't know this because you have to have studied public health rather than legislative drafting to know this. But there was a period of time where special protections referred to keeping women out of the workplace before or during pregnancy because of fear of harm to the unborn from exposure to dangers in the workplace. In the 1950s, it kept airline stewardesses off of planes under the so-called no-show rule. If it looked like they were pregnant, they lost their job. Teachers in many schools had similar things. And the really controversial one in the US Supreme Court is we have IUAW versus Johnson Controls. The US Supreme Court unanimously said it's discrimination to forbid these ladies to work. But the reason that facts came to the court's attention was that the employer was a very toxic lead pigment place and making batteries and things like that. And there was enormous fear that the babies that were exposed in that area would have all kinds of malformations. And the employer had said, you want to work here, you have to show us that you're sterilized. This is US case law. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. You can't make them stay out. You can't make them get sterilized. But they never put in any law that said what it means to enable those ladies to go to work. So we don't have in the United States, for example, paid maternity leave at the level that other countries do. And these were the special protections that are still in the CEDAW. To me, this is a problem, but since we haven't ratified, it doesn't bother us. The other places where you see kinds of discussions, of course, the ILO where I worked, very famous for their maternity protections. It was their third out of the nearly 200 standards that they have created since they were started in 1919 after the end of World War I, not World War II. And we were always very proud that we were part of the UN system by choice because we were founded under the League of Nations and made some compromises. I'm not quite sure what they were. But this maternity leave documentation is as old as the ILO itself. And it was revised in the late 20th century. We're still talking positive law. And it has things like leave in case of illness or complications. A lady can leave work with pay before the end of pregnancy. And if it needs to be extended for postpartum reasons, there are mechanisms for that. And employers can be punished for failure to comply. And the African Union, because the US, we say, oh, you know, you have to be so rich to afford health care. The African Union also talks about the right to health and has several initiatives to fighting maternal mortality. This is the World Health Organization in 2022, strategizing to accelerate the reduction of maternal mortality in the African region. And there's a very, very cohesive plan of action that's in place. And also, of course, the Council of Europe, I love them because they paid me. But the Council of Europe is 47 nations. Even Russia, who got kicked out because of the atrocities they're committing in the Ukraine, still is part of the pieces about the right to health that are in the European Charter of Human Rights. They did not cut out their human rights to health law when they got kicked out of the Council of Europe. And the Council of Europe is fascinating. I love to talk about it because they have a court where individuals can sue their own country in order to have their rights affirmed. So 47 countries here, a bunch of countries in Africa using WHO language there. There's a lot of people that have law that says there's a right to health and law that impacts maternal mortality. So this is from CDC and from the European Union. The maternal mortality is a problem everywhere. I mean, we're not God, even with the good help of caring religious people. It is always possible someone could die during pregnancy. But what you're going to see is that technology is taking us to a place where we have really limited maternal mortality if we make that effort. The European Union has been, since 2020, having a specific agenda around beating maternal mortality with some very good results. And CDC, this is from my classmates, this is some of the key definitions for the purpose of our talk tonight, especially after a lovely dinner. It's about ladies not dying either during pregnancy, childbirth, or reasonably soon after the birth of that child, say in the first few weeks in some measures of endpoints, or a few months, depending on who's measuring it. And we're talking about live births, but obviously stillbirth is yet another dimension of the same problem. And these are some of the things that CDC says are the causes of maternal death. According to the USA Today reporting from CDC in August of last year, 80% of the maternal mortality that we see in the United States is avoidable. I would love for somebody to really take the time and look at the rules that CDC has talked about and the jurisdictions that do or don't apply those rules and see if that's really 80% or more or less. But the point is that these are all things that are reasonably, I won't say common, but they've been part of humanity for a very long time. These are not strange new diseases. These are not exposures to toxins we never heard of before, like titanium dioxide at the nanoscale, so we don't know what the effect is. These are reasonably straightforward problems that humanity has known about for a while. And so now, actually next week, the National Academy of Science, which I love, it's a beautiful building, they're very nice people, they're gonna have a series of webinars for free on maternal health disparities and women behind the data and what does this look like. And just this morning, the Today Show announced that breast cancer is on the rise in women under age 40. Now this, I'm not enough of a scientist to tell you it's linked, but I am aware of enough literature to say that there may be something we should be looking at carefully, because breast cancer under 40 is something that we worked very hard to try and have much less of, and we were really near getting it under control in a reasonable amount. So also USA Today in the August article I talked about not only that the maternal deaths were on the rise. At the time, CDC said that there were approximately 23 maternal deaths. We're not even talking about complications after birth, and we're not talking about the effect on the child. We're just talking maternal deaths, 23 per 100,000 live births. And another source said 30 in the United States of America last year, okay? And then there's also a very invidious problem that it does seem to be different among different ethnic groups. But to me, I'm not sure how important that is, because we're talking about maternal mortality. We're not talking about a broken arm or a broken leg that then heals, and gee, who heals first? The end point is a very grim and expensive outcome. And at the National Academy of Sciences, there was a lecture by the president of Wellesley, who's a very fine physician, and she said one of the things that's a problem in maternal mortality is we are not looking at the long-term impact of the ladies who survive. Her research is looking at things like long-term impacts after delivery and years after delivery, and she believes that 30 to 40 years after birth, there's twice the risk of cardiovascular disease leading to death. That was where her research was going. All of this, from a scientific point of view, you need to care about maternal mortality. This is, to me, the reason why I've given you this talk tonight. This is maternal mortality rates in the OECD countries. Another really gorgeous bureaucracy. I mean, just beautiful building. They took a palace and put the most gorgeous glass and sculpture, and then the meetings are wonderful. Okay, so all these people at the bottom, these are countries in OECD, these are our peers. If you look at Norway, the maternal mortality is around 2 per 100,000. If you look at these other countries, you're looking between 3 and 5. Greece, very low maternal mortality. We are the blue line. We are exponentially higher than our economic peers. And this makes it very hard to say that it's about money because these are our economic peers. And our numbers look like what's a really poor country. So the point here is that there may be some correlation, according to the literature, between maternal mortality and the right to health. The fact that the government has some obligation to concretely take that positive law that I've been telling you about from the 20th century that didn't exist if all you believe is that there's natural law, and take that and apply it to help people. And the reason I say this is, first of all, you have that 47 countries in the Council of Europe who have really good records, not only in maternal mortality, but in a whole bunch of other health realms. And in Latin America, Brazil stands out because they don't have a constitutional right to health. They have a federal statute. And there's a lot of debate about whether it's broad enough and whether it works well. But as a general matter, in Latin America, there's over 30 countries that have a constitutional right to health. So now you're looking at 77 countries. And then there are African nations. Remember, I told you when they decolonized, they took that WHO gorgeous, most artful language of the 20th century and threw it into their constitutions. And so there's a whole debate you could get into, how many countries precisely. But now you're already looking at near 100 countries. And the result is that if you, depending on how you define it, some people say it's 183 countries. The US is an outlier here. We don't have a codified right to health on a federal, national, constitutional level. And WHO in 2013 had a really marvelous study that they revealed. It was called Women and Children's Health, Evidence of Human Rights Impact. And a law team from WHO looked at the evidence that explicitly human rights shaped interventions have contributed to improvement specifically in women and child's health. And this has been revised in 2020, but the point is, as long as 10 years ago, 11 years ago, the idea that there's some correlation between law and the legal status of health and how that translates into well-being in that WHO legal definition, that's already been talked about. So, what's required for us to operationalize positive international rights law to protect women's health and reduce maternal mortality? Let's assume for the minute that if that natural law that I showed you was really persuasive and compelling, I wouldn't be here talking tonight. Because if it was just the morality, the ethics, the natural right, then why would we have 11 times more maternal death than Norway? Why would we have a situation where the projections are for these things to rise and we have no end in sight? Even if you take it apart and say, well, in some races it's really 30 or 40 women, and in some races it's only 10 or 15. That doesn't work as a useful analysis. So what I want to do now is switch gears slightly and tell you that compared to our colleagues abroad, we have a very fractured healthcare patchwork. I got into a lot of trouble in 1996 because I refused to call it a system in my lecture. But it's not a system. We have several competing components of law. First of all, federally, we do not have a single cohesive healthcare system. And if you believe the WHO report and the follow-up reporting, then this is really key to having good health care, is to have some baseline bedrock concept of health in the system itself. So we don't have such a magic sentence. We don't have something that says you have to have health. We have a theory of parens patriae that says the government is responsible for healthcare, but it's a theory that's not codified. When they taught it in the global health regulation class last year, they talked about it a very long time, but nobody really had it in any state constitutions. It's not in the federal constitution. We have a lot of federal laws. They have overlapping jurisdiction. They spend a lot of money. We spend more per capita on healthcare than other countries in the world combined. There's like, you could put 3 or 4 European countries together. They're not spending as much as we spend per capita. And they have better outcomes. They live longer. They don't have the maternal mortality we're facing. So we have all these laws. We're spending this money. I'm not persuaded it would cost us more if we learned to manage it better. But I'd love somebody to challenge me on that with data. I'd love to see that. We have Medicaid, we have the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, we have Obamacare, we have Medicare.
Zero means you hit it.
But we also have risks from gun violence that other countries aren't reporting if they have it. I'm not talking about war zones there. We have poor food quality, which is something I have written about extensively during my global health law writings, because I looked at nanoscale materials in food, which are regulated in the European nations and are not looked at in the FDA. If you're in active military, you get really good health care, but veterans are really a subject very similar to maternal mortality, that people see a political concern about how poorly they're treated. What we learned from COVID is we don't even really have power across the entire country. In COVID, we discovered that we had over 2,000 municipal jurisdictions with the power to talk about whether you stay home and whether you have a vaccine. So there is really a lack of coherence in our law. You can read a lot of law and not come up with a clear, concise answer. And as I've said a bunch of times, we don't ratify those pretty words that other countries are obeying. So we don't apply positive law, and we may have some natural law, but we're not really using it. What's a country to do? Well, I'm going to take 1 second to talk about my favorite subject, which is nanotechnology, because nanotechnology does help us. And the reason I believe nanotechnology helps us is we're seeing these low numbers in other countries. It's not that they have magic wands and silver bullets and tons of really great medicines that we're too poor to purchase or distribute to our people. They're applying technology in ways that make enormous sense and are probably not just cost effective,
I just got it all.
but probably a lot cheaper than the things that we're doing instead. So my working assumption throughout my writing about nanotechnology, which began 15 years ago, is that nanotechnology's revolution for commerce will revolutionize public health. I wrote the first doctorate in Switzerland about the law of nanotechnology. All I can really tell you is that it's a lot of nanoparticles in making up a few molecules together. Everything is made of nanoparticles, including us, but we've learned to manipulate them. That if you took one of my hairs, the diameter of one of my hairs is 100,000 nanometers. So we're talking really, really small, and the scientific literature used the word revolution, and I said, wow, if it's gonna revolutionize science because it changes our understanding of matter, and it's gonna change commerce because we have all these cool products we didn't know, and the mRNA was supposed to really prove this to a lot of people, because the way we came out with that vaccine for something we didn't even know of when we started studying nano, it just proved that you could do really amazing things. I said, that's gonna revolutionize public health. And what you have there, we're right in the middle. You have right in the center of this meeting of disciplines, good public health, emerging technologies such as nano, and a bunch of nano-enabled stuff. Today we heard about AI. AI is a nano-enabled technology, and international law. We're right there in the middle. And we bring together our tools, and this slide is my favorite slide in all the slides I've ever owned. This slide was given to me by Dr. John Howard, who is still the director of the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. He gave it to me in 2008 when he was visiting us in ILO, and he gave a lecture that transformed my life. He gave the lecture, Nanotechnology, the Newest Slice of Global Daily Life. And he had this slide in 2008. I have given this talk where there were people in the room that were not yet born. This slide in 2008 showed already the applications of nanotechnology to stuff in every day that we are definitely using. Cars with tires that have carbon nanotubes to make them go longer and faster. Headlights that shine brighter, all that lead stuff you see. Wonderful pharmaceuticals. Refrigerator linings from silver nano that kills bacteria and keeps food clean and safe. And a whole bunch of other stuff. Lining on clothing, things like that. Just about everything in daily life. And John gave me this slide 2008 and apologized. He said, Ilise, I'm sorry. This slide is outdated. This slide only reflects a small fraction of what's on the market in nanotechnology today. So I said to myself, Self, what if we decided no mom should be left behind and we had nano-enabled emergency kits with LED lights and solar batteries and all kinds of stuff? Why do I think so? Because the nano-enabled technology of using a lot of communication with a lot of stuff and a lot of information traveling very rapidly, that you can have sonograms on a cell phone. There's no reason that a woman should be pregnant and what they call in a maternity desert. There's no reason, because somebody could call and give her help and somebody could use these things. So that could take a bite out of our maternal mortality. Nanomedicine, I'm sure that there are treatments for many of those things on that list that CDC said. So in summary, I say there's solutions if we care. If we either buy the story that there's a natural right to health, or in the alternative, if we decide to sign on to some of this positive law that seems to be keeping other countries healthier and living longer. The first thing would be to apply a lot of this nano-enabled stuff. And a lot of this is really just thinking about the pieces. What municipal law, what federal law, what things that nano has helped us have in life that we could put together so that we could really try to help these ladies. The other thing, I think, is maybe the time has come that we think about a constitutional amendment that codifies that right to health so that we are like our peers, so that we are not an outlier when you go to an international meeting and they say, well, it's very nice you're telling us advice, but you don't sign anything and you don't have a right to health. Your pregnant ladies are dying and your guns are going off. Why should we listen to your advice? And the sentence would actually be quite simple. This sentence is a paraphrasing. Remember I told you about the Council of Europe? And there are 47 countries. Well, when you join the Council of Europe, there's a treaty. And the treaty says words very similar to this. And I have played with them a little to make them more American. But the idea would be that all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof shall have the right of access to preventive health care, the right to benefit from medical treatment, and shall enjoy the protection of their health to the extent feasible and consistent with equal protections of the law. This is just an idea, but the idea is it doesn't talk about money and it doesn't talk about specific groups. And we have always been able to successfully turn little bits of language into real systems in our country. In conclusion, I believe that if we took this array of tools, the nanotechnology and the new science, and the laws that exist, and the political will and desire to make women's lives healthier and longer, consistent with the way our peers live in other countries. We might even achieve some of what Navi Pillay talked about when she was the High Commissioner for Human Rights. A huge amount of work, she said, remains to be done to transform human rights from abstract promises, that natural law stuff I told you about, to genuine improvement in the daily lives of all people, especially those who are currently marginalized or excluded. And I would marginalized and excluded to include pregnant women and their babies. I thank you for your attention, and I welcome your questions.